Take your Bible and turn with me to the book of Colossians and the 3rd chapter. Before I read a section from Colossians 3, we have a thank you card from Rod Snyder I'd like to read for you. He writes, "Thank you so much for the cards, visits, offers of help, phone calls, and most of all, your prayers. I am thankful for the Lord's healing and hoping to be fully healed and back to normal activities soon." Signed, Rod Snyder. So glad for Rod's healing and recovery after his fall and cracked ribs, and glad for the progress he's making. I'd like to direct your attention to Colossians 3. I'd like to read from verse 8 down to verse number 15. Colossians 3, beginning of verse 8. "But now you yourselves are to put off all these: anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy language out of your mouth. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have put off the old man with his deeds, and have put on the new man, who is renewed in knowledge according to the image of him who created him, where there is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcised nor uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave nor free, but Christ is all and in all. Therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering, bearing with one another and forgiving one another, even if anyone has a complaint against another, even as Christ forgave you, so you also must do. But above all these, put on love, which is the bond of perfection. And let the peace of God rule in your hearts, to which also you were called in one body, and be thankful." Life in the world is about kingdoms, rules and authorities that are designed to promote and protect certain interests and to resist others. The book of Colossians is about the supremacy of Christ over his kingdom, that he is seeking to rule and to reign over a redeemed people. And Christians are people who have transferred kingdoms from one kingdom of the world. They have come into, by belief and faith, into the kingdom of Christ. The book of Colossians is seeking for people to live under that supremacy and in the sufficiency of that supremacy. And under that supremacy, they're called to bring into their own lives attitudes and actions, conduct that is in line with the kingdom of Christ. This morning we look at a particular call to that transition of kingdoms and the implications of that kingdoms in terms of our speech, how we speak. Every kingdom has at least one that's going to last, has some kind of system of defense or some system of protecting itself or promoting its own interests among conflicting interests abroad. And so a country or a kingdom has an army that it trains, that it equips with different weapons and different strategies. Well, the words of our mouth are like those that kind of arsenal. Our words are a way that we promote a kingdom. There are ways that we defend a kingdom or take on the offensive to promote the interests of a kingdom. And part of a Christian's responsibility is to bring their words from the kingdom of an old world that has been rejected or repented of, and bring those words into a new kingdom, into promoting a new interest of that of Christ. And so the text that we're looking at this morning is about the transition of certain attitudes and words that we once used to promote a kingdom to now a different set of attitudes and words. And I'm thinking at Colossians chapter 3, verses 8 and 9. Let me read them again to bring them to our attention. "But now you yourselves are to put off all these: anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy language out of your mouth. Do not lie to one another, since you have put off the old man with his deeds." There are certain things a Christian is to put off, to do away with, in terms of their speech. And it begins with certain attitudes. We looked at those last week in terms of anger or wrath, that those are dispositions of the heart, but those dispositions don't just stay in the heart. They get expressed through our mouths. They get expressed through our words or in the modern era through our text on our cell phones or through our fingers on the computer through social media. Those are expressions that are coming from our heart. And we are to tame them for the cause of the kingdom of Christ. We're to bring them in view of the interests of Christ and the cause of his kingdom. And it can be a great challenge. I'd like to address that challenge this morning of the problem or the challenge of taming our tongue and channeling our communication to be always pleasing and always promoting of the cause of Jesus Christ and his supremacy. Think with me about communication. We read a while ago in our service, James chapter 3. James clearly is writing to a church that was struggling with conflict in their community. And so you can see that in chapter 1, he's talking about not being quick to get angry, but being slow to speech and listening and not letting our anger get the best of us. But in chapter 3, it comes full blown that he challenges us particularly with our communication problems and our struggle. And what he begins by talking about, if you could turn to James chapter 3 as we use this text to reflect upon the call to put off certain speech and put on other speech, James has some helpful teaching about communication. So notice with me in James chapter 3, in verse number 3, we read, "Indeed, we put bits in horses' mouths, that they may obey us, and we turn their whole body. Look also at ships, although they are so large and are driven by fierce winds, they are turned by a very small rudder wherever the pilot desires. Even so, the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how great a forest a little fire kindles." So, James wants us to think about the power that our words have, the power that our communication has. What we express through our mouths or various other media of expressing is powerful, portrayed by the tongue. And James sees that it might be surprising to us because the mouth is fairly small in comparison to the whole body, and the tongue, that particular part of the mouth, the facial features, that whole system that enables us to enunciate words, to pronounce words, that it has a surprising power to it, that it betrays its size by its greater effect. And he compares it to the small bits that a horse is guided by, or by the rudder of a great ship, that in comparison to the size, the weight, the birth of the ship, that the rudder is a very small thing, but the pilot is able to steer many tons of ship's of weight and its great size with a very small rudder. So the tongue is surprising, our words are surprising, and how much power they can have. That we would be foolish and really purposely ignorant if we didn't realize how important our speech was. The way that you talk to your parents, the way that you talk to your children, the way that you talk to your spouse, the way that you talk to your friends or opponents or colleagues on the job or your employer or your employees has a surprising power to it. There's a surprising ability of words to do more than we would think that maybe. We might say, oh, they're just words. Now, this ought not to be surprising to anybody that reads the Bible because words have a great importance in biblical theology. God himself, of all immensity and vastness, changes the world just by speaking, by the speech of his mouth. And he speaks words to us. And he tells us that our words are important, and we surely can know it's true, that words have a great power to them, a great influence to them. They can make a great difference. That words can change kingdoms. The great Soviet Union, that great empire, in the end maybe was greatly hurt by its fiscal policies that just didn't work. But perhaps even more than that, it was hindered by testimonies of reports of words about its injustice of treatment of people. So that some have said that Alexander Solzhenitsyn brought down the Soviet Union by a word of truth. By just speaking words, brought down a whole kingdom and empire with missiles and tanks that words brought down an empire. So it has been through history that words can bring down or raise up empires. So they can do families. Families have been destroyed, actually for generations, because of poor speech patterns, of poor speaking have destroyed families. It's destroyed churches. It's destroyed communities. We have a whole nation now that words have become, have been weapons that can be very powerful. And of course now we have technologies that broadcast our words to a wide range of audience. And perhaps maybe even contribute to the problem because we can feel very safe because no one perhaps can see us, or we're not with the people that we're speaking to. And so our words can have a far-reaching spread of damage. Some medieval tale tells about a parishioner that spoke some evil word of their minister, and it spread throughout the countryside, and the person felt bad about it, went to the minister and apologized and said, "I'm sorry I said this thing." And the minister said, "Here's what I want you to do. I want you to take a pillow, a feather pillow, and go up to the bell tower of the local cathedral here and cut open the pillow and let all the feathers go." And so they did, and they said, "Well, now what?" And said, "Now I want you to go and retrieve all the feathers that are scattered." And they said, "I could never do that, they're all over." He said, "Well, that's the damage that speech does. That you can never get it back. Once it's out, once it starts spreading, the damage is probably irreparable in some sense. The tongue, our speech, has a surprising power to it. James also tells us that this power is very difficult to control. Notice in James chapter 3, verse number 2, he says, "For we all stumble in many things," and who doesn't? We all have faults. We're not quite always coordinated, especially you're growing a little bigger and your feet get a little bigger than your habits are or your skills are, or you are not quite as dexterous with your hands as you might wish you were, and so you fumble over something, and trying to thread that needle can be hard, and a lot of difficult things. And so we all stumble over a lot of different things. But he goes on, "If anyone does not stumble in word, he is perfect, able to bridle the whole body." So it's James' way of saying it's the most difficult thing you have to try to do. That if you can thread the needle perfectly, if you can walk a tightrope, if you can do those amazing things on the balance beam and perfectly control your body, that's easy stuff compared to controlling your tongue. That the tongue is a really challenging part of human life. He goes on later in verse number 7, "For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and creature of sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind." So you've been to the circus, or you've been to the zoo, or you've been to SeaWorld, or seen some demonstration of some master caretaker of animals that has tamed the lion. Those things that they get the elephants to do. The elephants that climb on each other and amazingly skillful, considering their bulk and size and awkwardness of that they do all these amazing things. And you've perhaps seen, the monkey be able to do these things, or the cats the cat's kind of a mystery to me. I mean, I know cats are extremely dexterous, but getting them to do what you want them to do, and now that's the real trick. But dogs, all these things, they do all these things. I was watching yesterday, you probably have seen it too, the Facebook video of the 3 sheepdogs that get the geese to go through the hoop. And these dogs, so the dogs are training the geese to obey them. And it's pretty amazing what they get these. And so, that's really amazing. I don't know about reptiles. I guess you can kind of get reptiles to do something. I'm not sure you totally tame them, but you can control them or birds can do all kinds of tricks. And of course, that's helpful for shows or movies or whatever to do these tricks. So people have been able to tame all kinds of wild beasts. One of my favorites was the SeaWorld exhibition, where the sea lion and otter show is always my favorite show at SeaWorld. The stories and the little things, they get these creatures to do that are kind of comical and amazing in of themselves. So these skilled people can get animals to do things. Well, notice the next verse, verse 8, but no man can tame the tongue. It's unwieldy. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. So as amazing as these things are and difficult as they are, you can imagine how long it must take to train some of these animals to do the tricks that they have them do, and the danger of it, and how do they get the whale to do these things? Well, if you can imagine that, it's way harder to get people to train to contain their tongue, to get their communication under control. In other words, it's a call to take it with great seriousness because it's not going to come easily. This is not the thing where you one day decide, well, from now on, I'm going to have perfect control of my speech. Yeah, right. It's going to take week after week, day after day, stumble after stumble, pitfall after pitfall, addressing to get the tongue, the speech to fit what God wants it to be. It's going to take all of your study. It's going to take your effort to get this thing under control. The tongue has an unwieldy power, and it has a power that can result in great harm or great good. It has this kingdom power to kill or to heal. Look with me at Proverbs. That Proverbs particularly addresses the power of the tongue either for good or to do evil. Look with me at Proverbs chapter 12. And verse number 18, there is one who speaks like the piercings of a sword, but the tongue of the wise promotes health. So the kind of speaking, it would be like a sharp, razor-sharp sword that has the power to puncture or to slice or to kill someone. And some people's speech is like that. They're able to cut with their speech. They're able to wound somebody. They're able to kill someone's spirit, to wreck someone's character, even wreck their lives with their speech. But others have a different kind of power. Though the tongue of the wise promotes health, there's another kind of person that's able to speak that encourages people, that makes them feel more confident or makes them see life in a new and a fresh way, and it expands their livelihood. So the power of the tongue can either be for great evil or for good. Look at Proverbs 18 and verse number 21. Proverbs 18, verse 21. Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruit. Back a couple chapters to Proverbs chapter 15. And verse 4, Proverbs 15, verse 4, a wholesome tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness in it breaks the spirit. So that image of that mysterious and wonderful tree in the Garden of Eden, the tree of life, that if you eat it, you have life that never ends. A word of wisdom and grace can be like that. Can be life-giving, life-sustaining, but the opposite is one that could take life, that can cut into, make things fall apart and degenerate. And so the tongue has a power, and you ought to confess it. You ought not to say, oh, I'm just a little person and my words don't do that much. You ought not to say, well, I don't really have the ability to do that. I'm slow of speech, and nobody listens to me anyway. James wants us to know, Jesus wants us to know that our words matter, and they can have a powerful influence upon others. And we need to get a handle on it, even though it would appear to be unwieldy or uncontrollable. We've got to confess the power of our words. We ought to realize that our words come from a kingdom root, a kingdom source, a desire to have a certain ruler or a certain administration be in charge. So in Colossians, Paul is writing about Christ being supreme over all things, and him challenging that we once had a certain promotion of the kingdom of self that now has died, that our conversion from one life to another is one of dying to one life and kingdom and coming to live in a new one, that our minds are now at the right hand of the Father, that we are now living his life. And part of that is to get to the source of these weapons that these kingdoms use to bring them under a new control. And so part of that control is to renounce the reign of an old self-expression. Now here I don't mean to pick on artists, because there's a great usefulness to artists who are maybe able to express feelings in a powerful way, or their creativity of expression of perhaps their joy or even their sorrow is very useful. I don't mean to pick on that. What I mean to bring out in the open is the kingdom of self-centeredness. The kingdom that says, I'm going to make much of me at the expense of you or the expense of them to promote my particular cause. That's what I'm challenging, that we need to renounce. That kingdom of self that uses words to defend oneself at the harm of others, or to go on the offense to tear down others to promote one's own kingdom, but rather to channel our words to the kingdom of Jesus Christ, which is rooted in peace and in glory and everlasting life. But we need to renounce this reign of self-expression that does so much harm. It begins, as Colossians 3 verse 8 tells us, in anger and wrath. But it goes on to having those attitudes of the heart that outwork to use as weapons towards others. And one of them is called malice. If you look at Colossians 3 verse 8, we see that this malice is this first of these objects of a way of speaking. The Greek word for malice, kakia, means to promote badness, to promote evil, to malign or to cause something bad to happen, to cause people to feel bad with no hope of recovery. It's to wound. It's to promote some malign kind of thought that hurts. The second word is that of blasphemy. The word here means to charge somebody with badness, with bad action, to vilify someone, to make someone seem like the devil. Frequently it's used in relation to the way people might demean God. They might speak a way to talk about God not existing, or God not in control, or God doing some bad thing, to blame God for something. That would be blasphemy. But it can also be used of other people, to talk about people or to people in a way that would charge them with some kind of evil and make them seem like evil itself. Now sometimes people get in these adversarial relationships and this ongoing thing where they just tear each other down. They begin to think in terms of the other people as only bad, and then they speak towards other people and about other people as only bad, to vilify, to treat them as if they were evil itself. That would be blasphemy. The third expression he uses is filthy communication. That is speech that ought to be shameful, that ought to not be used in any kind of civil company. Dirty speech or demeaning speech that is degrading of human dignity. And so to call people like bad names, to reduce someone that's made in the image of God, James calls it cursing. We bless God with one word and then we curse another. To demean their dignity, or to lower them, to speak filthy language about someone or about something. That's not conducive with the kingdom of Christ. And then finally in verse number 9 we see this category of lying. That is of talking about things in an untrue, inaccurate way. So it could be a lie made out of whole cloth that is a totally made up lie, or more commonly, a truth that is twisted so that it becomes misrepresenting. So maybe only half of the story, or perhaps only parts that we wanted people to know. So when people speak like that, they're communicating something that's false. Even if in some respects there's truth in it, that its general impression is false. It could be exaggerated, or key points left out, or the context missing. So all that kind of miscommunication falls in that category. So we ought to renounce that kind of expression. And this involves really two steps. One is to pull out the root that causes the problem, to pull out the deep roots that have produced the words that are coming from an attitude, from a feeling or a thinking that is wrong or hurtful. Look with me at James 3 once again. James addresses this. James is clearly targeting people's speech and wanting people to take responsibility for their speech. But notice where he goes with this in James chapter 3 and verse number 13. We read, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom." So he's going to promote wisdom here. He's going to promote a true understanding of things. So we need to be careful, because sometimes people are really smart with their words. In fact, there is an expression we use, like maybe when a child talks back to his parent, we might say, "Don't be smart." And some smart kid says, "What, do you want me to be stupid?" And, we're like, it's an idiom. And that idiom is there's a kind of an intelligence that uses words to hurt. And we get pretty good at it. And so in some respects, we might see we're smart, and we might use our skill to communicate something that is harmful. I don't know if you've ever, Shakespeare is good at this, that Shakespeare has some of the most clever insults in all of literature. In fact, I saw a book that listed all the terms that Shakespeare used to put people down, people that talk about each other. And they're really amazingly creative, but they're kind of in the context of this person is using intelligence to cut somebody down. Or perhaps, if you've ever seen, you see it somewhat in American politics that people use words to hurt, but the Britons do it way better than we do. If you ever listen to British politics and their parliament, they have the most amazing ability to insult each other. It's like, I don't even know. They look up these terms and words, and they really are good at it. But there's a kind of intelligence that is cutting. And James is thinking about, okay, who's wise here? Who's got a wise speech? Who knows how to put words together, in other words? Well, look what he says where he talks about this in verse number 14. "But if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. This wisdom does not descend from above, but is earthly, sensual, demonic. For where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing are there." So James says this is not really a problem that's going to be handled by a speech therapist. That, you might have trouble pronouncing words, and so a therapist might help you pronounce properly. Or you might go to literature class or have an English professor teach you a greater vocabulary. Now, James says that's not going to help here. What we're talking about is what's going on in your heart. We're talking about envy. We're talking about a bitterness because you have a resentment against somebody. We're talking about a pride that's been offended, and someone's trying to get back at another person. There's no linguist that can help in that situation. There's no speech therapist that's needed here. What's needed is to pull the roots of sin out of our heart. That's where the focus is. And so if we're going to improve our speech, it needs to focus on what was it that the attitudes were that produced that angry response. What attitudes produced that cutting remark? What attitudes or beliefs or actions made me speak in a cynical kind of way or a demeaning kind of way? Well, what was it that the older brother cut down the younger brother because, he wasn't what he wanted him to be? What attitude did he have? It's not the words itself, it's the attitude of the heart. It's the pride. It's the self-centeredness. And that's where we need to address our communication problems. That kingdom source, that command and control center of the heart, needs to be the place that we focus on to address. So yes, if you are ill-tempered, it might be good if you just keep quiet for a long, long time. So better to think something and not say it than to think it and say it. But better yet, to change the way that you think. Better yet, to change the attitude of your heart. Better yet, to change the turmoil that's happening inside, and then the speech will become a lot easier to control as we change the attitudes of our heart. Jesus tells us that a good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good things, and an evil man out of the evil treasure brings forth evil things. In other words, your words are a reflection of what's going on inside. And sometimes in our world, we get a little concerned about what's going on inside. When we hear the words, sometimes it's the actual content of the words, sometimes it's the tone of the voice, that we think there's some corrupt thing that's growing inside. Then someone that is remarkably well-spoken and graceful, you think something good has happened inside. There's some kind of good reservoir of pure water that is resisting. They may even be spoken harshly against, but they speak well in return. Like Proverbs talks about, a soft answer turns away wrath. Where does that soft answer come from? It comes from within. And our speech needs to be coming out of a heart that's been thoroughly evaluated. Am I speaking out of envy or resentment? Has my pride been hurt, or is my arrogance building up that I think too much of myself or too well of myself that is causing my speech to be harmful? If so, that needs to be repented of. It needs to be brought before the throne and addressed. So after we think about that, or as we think about that, we need to then address the words themselves. And let me just address some of the categories that we need to be careful in our speech. Some of the bad fruit that comes out of our mouth. First is that of boasting, of talking too big about ourselves, or talking too much about ourselves, or talking only exclusively about ourselves. And it comes from a thinking too much of ourselves, of caring too much about ourselves. Now, boasting is kind of a really tricky thing, because boasting is something that we are so prone to do almost naturally. It's something you have to actually work against. At least I know it from my experience, and I talk to other people, I know it as well. It's something that comes so naturally that we are prone to make heroes of ourselves. We like to talk about our best accomplishments. We like to talk about how we got the great score on the test, or we accomplished something in sport, or we mastered some activity, and we boast. We want everybody to know, and so we're very tempted to do that. We're very tempted to make ourselves the center and the hero of our stories, even if it might be as a martyr that we might have failed, but we failed as a heroic martyr. And we tend to speak pridefully like that. Now, the strange thing about boasting is that while we're very tempted to do it in ourselves, we hate it when other people do it. You get so tired of that friend that always talks about their accomplishments. And you get so sick and tired of the person that's always parading themselves. And so it's so strange that on the one hand, we're tempted to do it as if it's something that would make us look good. On the other hand, when other people do it, we think, you look bad when you do this. So this problem of boasting, the problem of making too much of ourselves, it's the promotion of the kingdom of self. It's always such a careful matter that when we are talking about our accomplishments, that we do so in a way that doesn't put someone else in an awkward position or to put them down. We need to renounce our boasting. After all, it's only irritating, and in the end, it only makes us look worse than others, than we want to be. Another kind of bad speech is trivializing important things. For example, terms towards God or spiritual things. People might talk about God as the man upstairs, which is a way of degrading an exalted being into some, common speech. But we might have a strong tendency to talk about important things in very trivialized, unimportant ways, demeaning them in how we might speak about them. James talks about speaking ill of someone made in the likeness of God. To speak about people in belittling terms would be to trivialize them, or to take some important topic, perhaps like marriage or love, and to speak about it in a demeaning, trivial way, when it's a matter really of great importance for human life, that we take these things seriously and we talk about them in important ways. It doesn't mean all of our speech has to be always full of importance. I mean, when you're talking about sports, that's fine, just it's not a big issue. So, feel free to trivialize sports because it is trivial. It's not an important thing, but people are not trivial, and God is not trivial, and marriage is not trivial, or justice is not trivial. That these things ought to be spoken of with importance. Third, we ought to be just careful about too much speaking. James tells his church that let not many of you become teachers. Teachers have a couple of burdens. One is they're guiding the minds of people, so their words need to be true. They need to be accurate to the reality. So that's an important burden. And then they're just called upon to talk too much. And when you talk a lot, it's just a matter of time before you say something that you shouldn't say, or you didn't say quite right. And all of us ought to be careful about the words of our mouths. Proverbs 10, verse 19 says, "In the multitude of words sin is not lacking, but he who restrains his lips is wise." Now, I get the job of speaking a lot in church, and that's a dangerous calling to speak too much. The Lord's blessed me, though, with a more natural tendency that I don't speak a lot other occasions. One of the benefits of being quiet is people tend to think you're smart when you don't say anything. You just try it. You just go for a while, and just people assume you know what's going on, if you're quiet. Well, there is that proverb about better to not say something people think that you are wise or think you're a fool than to speak and remove all doubt. So there is that tendency of just restraining speech is generally better. If you are in doubt of whether you should say something that might be hurting or cutting, don't say it. Refrain from it. Withhold your speech. In a multitude of words, sin is not lacking. Jesus says, "But I say to you that for every idle word men may speak, they will give an account of it in the day of judgment." In other words, Jesus is pointing out some people are very bold to cut other people down, or to criticize, or to curse somebody. And Jesus is saying that's going to be judged, but not only that's going to be judged, but even a word that you might think was casual or careless, just a remark that was off the cuff that you perhaps didn't even think much about. Jesus says that word, that idle word, is going to be brought before his throne for judgment. So be careful about too much speaking, or too much babbling, if you will, from that Tower of Babel where no one really understands what you're saying anyway. Or dirty talk. Bathroom kind of talk. The kind of making words that are lowly and they're demeaning. They present things in a way that reduces them to, just mere biological mechanisms, and all that kind of dirty speech is demeaning to human nature. It's demeaning to our spiritual nature. So all that dirty talk, whether coarse jokes or calling people names, bad names, the way to demean somebody, all that dirty talk needs to be put off. Also, cursing of people or condemning people, to speak words that are condemning, perhaps without any due trial or due process, no thought to helping, but just a word of condemnation about somebody, something we ought to put off. Or we've mentioned that of lying, twisting truths, presenting truths or presenting something in a misleading or a outright false way. That we have a responsibility to tell the truth. Slander. We ought to put off slander. That is speaking about somebody that hurts them or hurts their reputation. So that could include like gossip that has a lie in it, or it could even be gossip that's true but not helpful. That slander is speech about someone that demeans their character or their reputation. Now, speaking about people is always a very dangerous, and we have to be very careful when we speak about other people. Speaking about other people, it's very easy to be wrong about them, or it's able to say something that might be true, but the person who hears it in a wrong way. That hears it in a misleading. Maybe they have a prejudice against that person, and when you speak about them, you incite their prejudice. So it's always better to talk to people than about them, right? It's a much wiser position. If you have an issue with someone, go talk to them. Talking about people, more often that's probably slander. Even perhaps maybe if you didn't mean it to be slander. Maybe you still misrepresented in some respect. But we need to be careful about how we speak about people, especially not to be careless about it, but to be very careful that our words are building up and helpful. And then the category that of the insult or the put down or the criticism or ridicule. Our words can be very harmful that are critical words, especially a critical word that really has obviously no intent to help, but only to imply, I want to live in a perfect world and you are imperfect and you have no part of my world. That kind of idea that I don't know what the solution is, but you aren't the solution. So those kind of critical words or ridiculing words or insulting words are very damaging. We ought to renounce that whole kingdom that comes from self-centeredness, that we want the world to serve us. We want our brothers and sisters to serve us. We want our children to serve us. We want our spouse to please us. And if they don't, we might just lash out as, I'm the king and you are an unfaithful subject, and that word can be harmful to them. We ought to put off all those words and promote the supremacy of Christ in every word we speak. In all the communication we have, that Christ is the answer, and cutting words or harmful words are part of an old system that needs to be done away with. So rather than promoting self, we ought to promote Christ in our words. We ought to herald Christ's rule over our words. He ought to have dominion over our words. Three things about that. One, it ought to come from a realization that we always speak in earshot of the throne of Christ. That he hears, and that we know that he hears us. And that our words should be measured in view of the judgment of Christ. The Apostle Paul tells us in Colossians 3 that we ought to set our mind on things above, not on things on the earth. That we ought to set our mind where Christ is. And so when we speak, we ought to be speaking in view of and in awareness of that Christ is measuring our words. And he knows what his supremacy looks like, and he knows what our words are like. And our words need to be brought in line with promoting his authority and supremacy. So like last week, the first step in getting control of your anger is to realizing that you can control your anger, and you must. The first step in getting control of your communication is to realize you can control your words, and you must control your words. It's an obligation to do so. You may never properly say, oh, I'm sorry I said that, I didn't think. You should never speak without thinking. You should never speak without having some awareness what the impact of your words might be. And I think it's a lie, actually. I think the most damaging words that people say, I didn't think, were probably pretty well thought out. Were probably crafted, and they were baked in some inner oven that wanted to say it. Now, we might think we didn't mean to say it at that particular time, but we are responsible for our words. We create our words, and Christ hears them. Second thing is we ought to bathe them and immerse them in the love of Christ. Look with me at Colossians 3 and verse number 14, the context where Paul is addressing this change of behavior, including change of speech, is challenged with a certain exhortation for the virtue of love. Verse 14, but above all these, put on love, which is the bond of perfection. So how can we improve our speech? We improve our speech by tackling the bad attitudes we have with love. So the bitterness we feel is a bitterness that has not loved as it ought, or the envy we have of somebody that always seems to get something better than we do, that always seems to get more praise, or they seem to get more privilege. And we might get envious, and we might want to say something hard about that. Well, the answer to that is to loving those people, is to being glad for their progress and being glad for the praise that they get. That we ought to take that into ourselves as our own, that when our brother or our friend or even our opponent has something good that happens to them, love is to share in their goodness. So rather than hating them because of their progress that seems to be above us, we think we are glad that because they are one with us. We are a common humanity. We are a common Christian body. We are a one family, and the good of one surely can be enjoyed by others as well. So embracing thoughts with love. That angry word can be toned down, can be transformed when it's attacked with the love of Christ. How did Christ treat us? When we were his enemies, when we spitefully spoke against him, when we totally ignored his authority or his gifts, and we were not grateful, that he had a right to be angry with us, but instead he spoke and acted with love towards us. So we also ought to attack our angry thoughts and our words of a cutting nature with loving that person, and therefore transforming our words. Even our enemies can be brought under that category as we face opponents, that we ought to face them with a view towards their good, a view towards their transformation. And we need to think, are my words going to be in a way that helps them change, or only becomes part of the antagonism against them that makes it all the more likely that they'll reject me or the truth itself? We've got to speak in view of Christ's love. Third, in verse number 15, we read, let the peace of God rule in your hearts, to which you were called in one body. Let the peace of God rule in the hearts. So bad words tend to come from stirred up inner feelings. They come from warring in our spirit. Usually a word that we regret began with some kind of agitation in our heart, that we're upset and we are in conflict, and that is just waiting to spill out, just waiting to be some expression. And Paul says the answer to this is to address the heart with the peace of God. Calm down, my soul. You're all agitated, you're all anxious, you're all striving and worrying with this thought and that thought, and you are doubting that Christ's peace is sufficient for the world. Calm down, soul. Get the peace of God ruling in your heart, and then speak out of that. Once Christ conquers the warring spirit in your heart, then your words can have a spirit that are words of peace. We have to let the peace of God rule in our hearts, and our words, our speech will be so much more pleasant when they come out of a spirit that's not raging and not seeking some kind of retribution, but has settled that Christ is sufficient for all of our needs. So fourth and finally here, we ought to become wordsmiths of good words. We ought to be articulate in the words of life. That is, we should work at being great communicators. I just recently was watching an interview with Ronald Reagan just a couple months before he was elected. And I was reminded in watching that of what a great communicator he was. In fact, that was his nickname, right? The great communicator. The ability to speak complex things simply and to speak controversial things in a non-threatening way. He was pretty good at that. a master communicating well. We ought to become master communicators of God's peace, his love, and his truth. I've been reminded recently, our Bible class at Christian school have been studying Proverbs, and as part of that, I have assigned us to read a biography of the British parliamentarian William Wilberforce, who fought against slavery, slave trade for 20 years, slavery itself for another 20 years. 40 years of his life was devoted to other things, but that cause was one of his great achievements. So eliminating the slave trade and then eliminating slavery in all the empire of Great Britain. When he first became a parliamentarian, he wasn't a Christian yet. He was fairly well educated, but maybe carelessly so. But he was an amazing communicator. He could speak powerfully. And it was always, part of it was the shock. It was the Abraham Lincoln shock. When Abraham Lincoln first appeared, people thought he was kind of not very attractive and, kind of backwoods. And when he spoke, people thought he would be like a little, and then he spoke like a brilliant speaker, and they was like, wow, Wilberforce was a very small person, but he spoke with a big voice. And he had this power to speak, and he also had the power to humiliate. I mentioned that the British had this ability to insult each other like with great skill. Well, he was one of the best of them. He could insult people and get his way by, kind of promote his cause. And when he first became a member of parliament, he was using that to attack other people to promote his causes. After he got saved a few years after he became a member of parliament, the Lord convicted him about that. Then he determined that he was not going to use the technique of cutting and humiliating anymore. And he began to devote himself to figuring out how, because he had to face really controversial things that needed some hard things needed to be said, but he was committed to find ways to say hard truths in gentle ways. Not that everybody always appreciated it, but some great change happened. And one of the changes that happened was that early in his political life, one of his opponents was Charles Fox, who he had humiliated. They were on the opposite side of a few issues, and he had cut down Fox a number of times. Well, after this change, he began speaking much differently. And Charles Fox not only joined his cause in the fight against slavery, he became a good friend. That his words so changed that his relationship changed with people. And later people began saying, I don't agree with Wilberforce on everything, but he's hard to dislike because he speaks so graciously. We should make it a mission for us to speak like that. That our opponents never have just cause to say, they're just so mean or they're so cutting. Yes, we'll have hard issues that people aren't always going to agree with us. Jesus himself was rejected in many times. But as far as it concerns us, we should be masters of communicating powerful truths as gently and as persuasively as we can. Well, what does that look like? Some different ways. We ought to begin with thanksgiving. Notice the text again in Colossians chapter 3, verse number 15, and let the peace of God rule in your hearts, to which you are also called in one body, and be thankful. Be thankful. I think you see this rather consistently in the Bible as one of the fastest, most powerful ways to change your life is to be thankful. It immediately reverses so many bad things that have been happening. When our kingdom of self we feel dethroned, we feel humiliated, we just want to get even. When we find something that is good and we've been blessed by, it changes our whole perspective. So thankfulness is a very important first tool to use in changing all of our life. And it can change our conversation. So if you're having conflict in your life, and you're having relationships where there's a lot of hard words and a lot of conflicting situations happening, practice praise and thankfulness as a regular part of your speaking diet, your speaking opportunities. If you're just having a hard time getting people to change to the way you want them, at least in an attitude, stop trying to change them for a little bit and appreciate and express appreciation, and you might find that relationship improves. You may find that relationship improves when you change from just critical words to appreciative words. At least the change of attitude, to realize this person probably is not the devil himself. That this person probably has some good qualities that if you find them and you speak them, you find a better rapport. Proverbs tells us a soft answer turns away wrath. And by long forbearance, a ruler is persuaded. Or a graceful word can break a bone. Proverbs tells us that a gentle word can break a bone. So we ought to change our attitudes with thankfulness. Second, we ought to craft words that are designed to listen. That is, people tend to communicate with others very selfishly. And while the other person is speaking, they're not really listening. They're thinking about their response. And they're in a Facebook debate, and they don't even bother reading what the other person wrote. Here's what they want to say. A best use of our words to begin is to use our words to help understand people. In other words, asking good questions. What did you mean by that particular expression? Or how did you feel? Or what'd you do in response? Or what? So using our words to draw out other people that our understanding of their position might grow. It's a good use of words to understand other people, rather than just leveling somebody with our own agenda. Why not pausing and finding out what they're thinking and what they're feeling? We ought to craft our words to be good listening words or good discovery words. To be an expert at uncovering, what are our children thinking and feeling, rather than just preaching at them. We also listen to them, and our words can help open up those avenues, or not just speaking at our parents, but using our words to understand them better. To craft words that listen well, that are designed to understand other people. Third, to craft words that are truthful. Our words need to be committed to truth. We need to be committed to truth. We need to trust the truth. Our environment, our cultural environment is such that people don't seem to trust the truth anymore. They don't believe that truth is a value that needs to be, so they ignore the truth. And it's a very dangerous world that you live in. If reporters don't bother to check out whether something's true, it's a very dangerous situation. Or if they purposely twist something to match their agenda. We ought to trust God enough to trust that the truth is the right thing to speak. And you actually have an obligation to know the truth. To not just hear rumor, or to think a thought, or to assume you know what somebody is thinking or what even they meant, and then begin to speak about it. But you have an obligation to get to the truth, in whatever sphere of authority you have, whatever sphere of influence you have an obligation commensurate with that. So the larger you are and the more broad your area is cast, you have a wider obligation to truth. Our words need to be truth-seeking words that come from truth-seeking, that they're accurate to the way things really are. And even better than that, truthful words are things that think from God's perspective, to bring God's truth into bear. So sometimes when I speak to kids about this, especially boys, junior high boys and stuff, I always talk about truth, and they say, well, what if the girl really is ugly? Shouldn't I be truthful? And I act like that. I laugh and say, young man, do you think God thinks she's ugly? Is that a truthful perspective? God doesn't think she's ugly. It's not a truthful word. It's your opinion. It's your self-centered view. It's the way that you want to process things. God has a different view, and we have an obligation to take upon God's point of view when we talk to other people. Not just what you think and feel, but what God thinks and feels about situations is where our words need to come from. We need to craft truthful, God-centered words. We need to craft words that are designed, intended, and carefully thought to build up, to edify. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 29, Let no unwholesome word proceed out of your mouth, but only what is for necessary edification, that it might impart grace to the hearer. Our words need to be crafted to build up. It doesn't do any good to cut people down. It doesn't help them, it doesn't help other people, and it doesn't help you. It's the weapon of self, because the kingdom of self is crumbling. It's kind of like the scorched earth. Remember when in World War II, Hitler's forces were being defeated, and Germany, the Allied forces were moving into Germany, and Hitler ordered them to burn everything. The enemy's not getting anything good, and that's the way our kingdom of self is. We can't possibly win. All we can do is make everybody miserable. And that's a really poor motive for communication, to make people miserable. A Christian is a person of hope. A Christian is a person who believes the supremacy of Christ is good, and truth is a helpful thing, and so my words can be designed to build up. Your words, your interaction with your younger brother. Yes, sometimes he's annoying, or your younger sister. So yes, sometimes she's annoying or she's immature. Well, so were you at that time, and maybe so are you now compared to somebody older than you. You can afford to encourage them. You can afford to build them up with your words. You can afford to be patient. You can afford to spend some of your energy in forbearing other people. So, parents have a tough job sometimes because kids can be immature. And that immaturity can be irritating. And that irritation can produce hard and harsh and angry words that really aren't going to edify. Now, there's a time for correction. There's a time for rebuke, there's no doubt. But it needs to be processed. Is this word ultimately going to help, or is it just going to be my kingdom saying, I'm living in a burning world and I'm just going to burn everything I can? No. The supremacy of Christ says you can trust that Christ can use your words for good and act productively, speak productively. Our words should be fitting for a moment, to know what the right time is to say the right thing. The book of Proverbs marvels at this skill. Proverbs 25:11, a word fitly spoken, that is a word that fits the moment. And it fits in a way that just matches the right thing. There's maybe a hurting person and went through a crisis, and a word just meets that person, or a person perhaps with a particular sin, and addressed in just the right way that might capture that person's attention and turn them from the sin. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold and settings of silver. In other words, something of ornamental beauty. Proverbs 15:23, a man has joy by the answer of his mouth, and a word spoken in season, how great it is. A word that fits the season, that matches a person's situation, that is the right time. Our words need to be crafted to those moments. Or consider Isaiah 50, verse 4. The Lord God has given me the tongue of the learned, that I should know how to speak a word in season to him who is weary. Isaiah says, a really wise person, a really smart person, has studied, and the Lord has taught him how to speak a word to a person that's weary and knows how to communicate to that weary soul. He awakens me morning by morning. He awakens my ear to hear as the learned. In other words, he hears some good word from God, and he uses that word to edify, to build up someone else. Our words need to be crafted to be fitting, to be helpful for the moment. And then finally, our words need to be full of grace. They need to be full of beauty of Christ. Colossians chapter 4, verse number 6 tells us, let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one. Our words should always be measured with that preserving additive of salt, that thing that helps things last longer, that helps things grow and be more tasteful. Our words need to be seasoned with grace. Be careful about defending your kingdom. You might find yourself defending something that's worthless. Rather, the supremacy of Christ is a kingdom that ought to channel your speech in positive directions, in helpful directions. May we be a church, and maybe we have families in our church that are well-spoken, that speak gracefully, that speak from trust and belief in the truth and Christ as the Redeemer of all things. We speak not as people to get retribution and revenge, but a people that speak to make peace, to make friends, to speak gracefully in those ways. Well, join me in prayer. Our Father and our God, I do pray that we would tame our tongues. It can be so easy to cut someone down or to say something harmful or to twist the truth to make ourselves look better, but it deceives. I pray, Lord, that we'd be a people whose speech is devoted to the truth, God's perspective. I pray, Lord, that our words would be measured to always be helpful. Even when we have to address some wrong, may they be so designed to benefit those that hear. I pray, Lord, that our hearts would be full of love and of peace, that our words would not come from an agitated, spiteful, or vengeful heart or spirit, but they might come from a soul full of trust and hopefulness. Even as we were challenged in Pastor Stauffer's song about Paul and Silas in the jail after having been mistreated, their words were not of bitterness and not of hate, but of praise. May our words be like that. We ask that you'd be honored and glorified in our speech, knowing that Christ is sufficient. May we turn to him and trust in him in all things. It's in his name we pray. Amen.